the mindset of course design. And I have a Menti poll here that you can click on or scan the QR code to access that poll, or you can also go down here to menti.com and use the code. And the question is, when designing a course, what is the most important component to consider? So let's take a moment to reflect on that. Yes, sorry. So you can join at menti.com, code 9563-5271. Is that working for everyone okay? All right. So let's see what answers we have coming in. So we only have a few here. We have some folks who do mention learning outcomes. Let me share this. Yay, Zoom. We have some folks mentioning learning outcomes, which is good. That's what we'll talk about, as well as, I'm sorry, y'all, I'm navigating 5 different things right now. As far as goals of the course content, again, goals of the course, skills and knowledge, bandwidth of students, and being flexible. That's also a good point, and we'll talk about how that might be a limitation behind backwards course design. And a user-friendly experience. I think these are all very great, very awesome things to think about when you set out to design a course. So very thoughtful from the outset. And if along the way you want to share anything about how you do this in your course design, please feel free to do so. Okay, I am going to switch back to my PowerPoint. All right, here we are. So when we talk about instructor versus student-centered course design, if it's instructor-centered, we're often thinking about this idea that knowledge is transmitted from instructor to learner. This idea that students are empty, uniform vessels who are just kind of open containers to take in whatever knowledge you have to give them. In this sense, then, they are passively receiving the information, not actively engaged. They may be mentally actively engaged through lecture. We just really can't tell that among all of our students, but not applying the concepts in some way. The emphasis is usually on the right answers and not kind of sitting in the messiness, gray area of learning. And usually the student is learning, taking notes, working alone. This is opposed to the student-centered context where learners are working together, constructing knowledge through discussion, through activities, right? The instructor is kind of taking a step back from being that person who is pouring the knowledge in and being more of a facilitator in the learning. So learners are actively involved in some way and often working in pairs or groups to construct that knowledge together. And so the emphasis, not necessarily on having the right answers, but maybe learning from errors, moving forward, or maybe grappling with kind of the more critical, difficult, or wicked questions in our fields and disciplines. So if we are approaching our course design from this teacher-centered perspective or mindset, what might this look like? And first, you would consider the content, right? So what is it that I need to teach that I know is important in this field that students need to learn? And then you think about, okay, how can I organize all this content? How can I organize it into a lecture? What readings might they need to do? You're looking at your content delivery tools. And then you think about assessment. How can I test what I taught? I've identified the content, I've organized it to give to the students. How can I then test them? And then you think, or you consider, what did I teach them in this unit in my lesson plan? And then finally, zooming out, what did I teach them in this class? So we can see that from a teacher-centered perspective, really the instructor is at the center of all the planning, right? What do I think is important in the content? How am I going to deliver it? How am I going to assess it? Right? What do I hope students get out of it? So when we shift this and take a look at how we create a course that is then learner-centered, we often approach this, or you'll hear about this approach called backward design. And this was a course design approach that was first articulated in 2000 by Wiggins and McTeague in a book called Understanding by Design. And really what this framework asks us to do is consider to place students at the center of our courses by considering what is it that we want them to know or be able to do by the end of the course. So instead of thinking first about your content, what you need to cover, what readings they need, you're first thinking, okay, what do I want my students to know or be able to do by the end of the course? And what are the objectives to get them there? And it is from there that you then design assessments. How do I know students got to this point? And then the learning activities. What are some things I need to do, supports I need to give students as the instructor in class so that they are making progress towards the assessments and the learning goals. So what does that look like in practice? Student-centered course design. So we see we're moving a different direction, right? We are going first from the right, the learning goal. What will students be able to do by the end of the course? And from there, you have these smaller objectives, right? What will students be able to do by the end of the lesson or a unit, however you're organizing your course? And then the assessment. How will we know if students are progressing towards that certain objective or learning goal? The learning activity. What do students need to practice to progress towards that assessment to show progress? And finally, the content, and that is, what do students need from the instructor to progress? I will say that I've been guilty first teaching, wanting to start with the content, right? Wanting to, oh, I love this reading, this reading. I want my students to read this without actually thinking about, okay, what are the learning outcomes and goals of this course? And will that reading actually help them on the assessments, right? And so it's a way to reverse and really kind of challenge ourselves to put ourselves in the shoes of the students and also think broadly about our discipline and the skills, values, habits of mind that our discipline seeks to instill in students. So another way to look at this is if we think about knowledge, we've talked about this a few slides ago. Teacher-centered, it's transmitted from instructor. Learner-centered, it's constructed by students. Student participation in a teacher-centered course is often passive, whereas learner-centered, it's more active, more engaged. And then we can see some of these other differences. You're really having to rethink your role as the instructor. So you are not the main authority or leader of the knowledge, but you're a facilitator, helping students to construct and make new meaning or understand meaning of the material. So we are gonna, in a workshop later this year, we're going to talk a little more about assessment and different types of assessments. But Teacher Center, we're looking at mostly those big tests, those midterms, the finals, final paper, midterm paper, whatever common assessments are used in your discipline. Whereas Learner Center, you're looking at a number of different assessments, smaller stakes and higher stakes. And then we can see that, what the emphasis are, the assessment methods, which we'll talk about in a different workshop if you're interested in it. And also, but this piece of the culture is interesting. So at Teacher Center, the academic culture can be more competitive or individualistic, whereas Learner Center, the ideal culture is collaborative, supportive, as a learning community, engaging, grappling with the topics together. So let's start thinking about our own course goals or student objectives, student learning objectives. So thinking about your discipline, and in an ideal world, what would students be able to do with the knowledge and skills they attain in your course? So take a moment to reflect on that, and then we'll see what kind of goals and objectives that your discipline might hold for students. Okay, so we have some answers coming in about knowledge and skills from your disciplines. We have able to communicate what they learned. And we can talk a little bit about how we can expand upon that when we're thinking about learning outcomes. Apply to their internships, jobs, or careers. So a very, kind of foundational, tangible outcome there. Being prepared to understand complex nursing skills, critically analyze sources that receive information from and see the world outside of their perspective. That's a very lofty but very great goal that I think many of us, especially in the humanities, have for our students in the classrooms. Effective communication, learn skills they can apply to their other courses. Yes, that's an important thing, I think, to think about when we design our courses. What skills might they need in order to move on to other courses, or that would be helpful in other courses? Is there anyone who wants to speak a little bit about the skills or habits of mind that their discipline tries to instill students through the courses, through course design, and ways in which you attempt to do that? Or speak to what you have answered on the poll.
I can speak a little bit about mine. Sorry if I have my camera off. I'm munching on my late lunch.
Oh, no, you're absolutely fine.
So I teach in the biology department and specifically physiology. And one of the ways we help students develop skills for like interdisciplinary connections and prepare them for other courses within our program is by using activities like case studies. So we present them with like a patient and here are their symptoms and guide them to figure out what's going on with the patient so that they can develop like a complex thinking skills, I guess. So like problem-based activities to get them to think independently, and then we try to drive our assessments in a metacognitive way and get them to reflect on their performance.
That's amazing. I love that pedagogical approach that you're taking to meet this outcome, right? And that you're engaging different domains of students through knowledge, metacognition, through the use of case studies as the approach in meeting that learning outcome. That's a great example. Thank you.
I can share something. So when I teach history survey courses as a teaching assistant, so usually the first half or the second half of American history that are typically incoming freshmen. And one of the things I like to have them really think about when it comes to primary sources. So that would be any sources from the time period. So studying something from the 19th century, it'd be something that was created, whether textual or drawn or whatever it may be. And then ask them to think about if somebody was going to write a history of your life today as a UK student in 2023, what would the primary sources look like? Like what kind of things in their own life are they're actively helping to create the history of what education at the University of Kentucky in 2023 looks like. And they have fun like, whoa, does that mean like texts and tweets and TikTok and other things that are very active in their social life? And then they see the bigger meaning of that. And that helps get them in the mindset of thinking of what primary sources of the time period are and how they can vary and come in many different forms. So that's just like kind of a fun way that I start off usually the semester.
Yeah, that's great. What I like about that is you're drawing on students' prior knowledge, what they can relate to then connect to, how a historian goes about doing their work and the use of primary sources. So that's a great example. Okay, let me switch back to my PowerPoint. All right. So to be able to really drill down and see what we are teaching, why we are teaching it, and how we can best engage students in our content, we have to first know what it is we want students to get out of the content, right? The learning outcomes that we hope for students. Now, I am presenting a very structured way in which it is proposed that we write learning outcomes so that they are specific. In some sense, they also allow us as instructors to determine whether students are meeting that particular criteria and outcome that we've set, that we hope that they will be able to meet by the end of the course. So you can see some examples here from not an outcome to one that is specific and an outcome that would be good to put on a course syllabus if teaching a similar course. So we see the first one, be given opportunities to learn effective communication skills. We can see that this isn't really an outcome. This is just something the students can expect in the course. You're here, you can learn effective communication skills, right? The second one is better, but it's vague. Have a deeper appreciation for good communication practices. So we all want students to have a deeper appreciation for our disciplines and our fields. The problem is, this isn't specific. And also, how do you might have a way of measuring deeper appreciation, but it's often hard to measure kind of an internal feeling like that in our teaching. The third option, less vague, understand principles of effective communication. Again, though, understand is kind of a vague verb that it's hard to assess, understand, right? Understand to what degree. And so what we're getting down to is a specific outcome to communicate effectively in a professional environment through technical reports and presentations. So we can see the journey that this first outcome has gone through here. First, structure, I want them to learn effective communication skills. I want them to also appreciate good communication practices and understand the principles of effective communication. So what is it? How do you want your students to show that? What is it you want students? What skills are you trying to get at? And that's where we get the specific outcome here. Communicate effectively in a professional environment. How are they going to show that they do that? Through technical reports and presentations. So we can really think in crafting learning outcomes by focusing on the action, kind of the active verb, and the criteria for showing that they have made progress towards that action that we identified. So how do we know, or in what domains are we creating these learning outcomes? I don't know how many of you all have heard of Bloom's taxonomy. Just raise your hand, thumbs up. Yeah. So Bloom's taxonomy was created in the 1950s, and it was crafted to look at the domains of learning for students, from remembering to comprehending, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. It was meant to be a hierarchical, the idea that memorization is kind of a lower order thinking skill, whereas creating is higher order, more engaging thinking skill that we should aspire our students to get to through our teaching. Now, not all courses or not all of your objectives are going to reach this or be in this create category, because students do have to have a foundation base level of knowledge before they can then move through these other steps. And what's helpful about having access to this taxonomy is that you have specific action verbs that you can draw upon when thinking about or creating your learning outcomes. So this is really helpful when thinking about, okay, what do I want students to do with this specific content? Do I want them to be able to analyze it? Do I want them to categorize it? Do I just need them to define these terms? Should they be able to explain something? So if you have a list of these action verbs by you when you create your syllabus, you really will find it helpful when you go to write your learning outcomes. You can find like 50 different versions of this if you Google it online, but this is just to introduce you to Bloom's taxonomy and the action verbs to describe learning across many different domains. Oh, Erica says these are also great for resumes and CVs. I can see that. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the tip. So what are some other examples of effective learning outcomes? So this is from English. Students will be able to apply critical terms and methodology in completing a literary analysis. So we can see the action here that we want students to do. And then we can also see how we can, for lack of a better term, measure their progress towards that action. They're going to complete a literary analysis. This is for a science course. Students will be able to acquire and synthesize scientific information from a variety of sources. So here we can see that what we're asking students, the skills here that we're asking them to do from many different sources. Now, what might be missing from this learning outcome, though?
I mean,
So
for
I
one-
go
oh,
ahead, CJ.
sorry. I was gonna say that it doesn't include communication amongst people. It's more like the skills, but then how would you use it verbally, for example, or
Yes, exactly. So under what criteria are we asking them to synthesize scientific information from a variety of sources, right? How are they going to communicate that and communicate it via XYZ, right? So I think that's a great point. From math, students will be able to apply algorithmic techniques to solve problems and obtain valid solutions. And then students, this is an interesting one. Students will be able to work in groups as part of effective teams. So this one isn't necessarily tied specifically to a certain disciplinary content that you want them to be able to apply or analyze in some way. But why might a learning outcome related to specific attitudes or behaviors be important to our classroom context? Has anyone used student groups or teams in their classes? CJ, do you use student groups or teams?
I haven't had a lot of opportunities to do that as a teaching assistant, but I think that it is helpful to build the type of environment that you want to foster in the class, because it's going to bridge that group work that if you are able to put in group work, if you have more like autonomy in the class as maybe you're the main instructor, it bridges the group work back to, okay, how are we communicating that to your
Yep.
fellow classmates? And like without that aspect, then how are you giving it life outside the group?
Yep, exactly. I think it communicates that also this is an important part of the course, right? And it might be an important skill for the field or the discipline. If you're in business, maybe you are always working in a team or a group of people. And so you need to know how to effectively do so. Okay, so let's practice, and you all can do this in the chat. But here is an outcome, and the challenge is to write it in a more effective way. So the outcome is students will understand the scientific method. First, what do you see as problematic about this outcome before we try to revise it so that it's better? Too vague. Yes, exactly. So it is too vague. Students will understand the scientific method. Okay, that's a very vague outcome. So let's think about how we can make it better as instructors if we are wanting this to be a core skill in our class. So think about it, chat your revision, and we'll take a look at them. Okay, so we have students will be introduced to the concept of the scientific method and apply it to design an experimental framework. I like that. You provide the context as far as they'll be introduced to the concept and they'll apply it. So the skill you want them to have from it to an experimental framework, which is kind of that specific, how you might look at their progress towards that skill. Erica, students will demonstrate understanding of scientific method by performing experiments and completing lab reports. Again, another great way, another good way to frame that learning outcome so that you're including something or including another part of the outcome that really speaks to or can help us as instructors measure that progress towards if they understand the scientific method. Any others who had thoughts on how they might revise this? All right, CJ, students will be introduced to the parts of the scientific method and put it into action by coming up with a question, hypothesis, and then test that hypothesis through the course of a semester-long experiment. That's very specific, includes, ways in which the progress can be seen in the classroom, as well as the different components, even breaking it down further of what you hope to see through the specific action you're having students do. Good. These are all good, actually. They're all would be great on a syllabus to point students toward when you're talking about what you hope that they gain from the class. So what are the benefits for the instructor of designing learning outcomes? Let's start there. I know this can seem like work that is, painful in some ways because it does force us to really think about what we want students to get out of our class. But what do you think are the benefits? What is the benefits of doing this type of exercise and reflection when you're looking at designing a course for you as the instructor? So Erica says it helps you stay on target. Can you talk a little bit about, Erica, if you want, how it might help you to stay on target or chat further? Helps organize the course and content. I absolutely agree with this. I think for me, when I start with the learning outcomes, it helps me to really have a framework for my course. So I find it very helpful for me to do this for my own sanity as far as where to even start in thinking about a course. So to explain further, Erica says it prevents you from going down too many rabbit holes, get sidetracked from the main goals. Absolutely. So it can really help you as the instructor to go back to these outcomes of the class. And Cece, am I pronouncing that right? It can help you remember. Oh, go ahead.
You're pronouncing it right. I was just saying that.
Okay, thank you. It can help you remember what your initial goals were. Yes. Yeah, so, this is also a good communication tool you can use for your students in explaining why you made the decisions you made in, your activities, for example, if you're doing group work, or in your assessments in the class. So what about for the students? Cece's given us a start for this. It gives them a sense of direction and a set of expectations for what they'll learn throughout the course. Yeah, and I think that's very important. It's important when we're thinking about equity in the classroom, and for students so that they're all have this transparency on what it is that they're supposed to be learning in the course and what skills you want all students to achieve in the course. Any other benefits you can see for students?
I can add something. I think that one of the most important things that you can do for your students is to show the passion for your own discipline. And by telling them that, I mean, maybe I'm too much of a romantic when it comes to teaching, but it's like I have so many exciting things I want to teach you guys, and there's only only a certain amount of weeks that we're together in the semester. So it's a good problem to have to be able to be open with them and on how you formed the structure of the course. And I also like giving them the ability to ask me what interests them. Like, is there something specific about, for example, like World War II? Do you want to hear about what the childhood experience of American children during World War II or during World War I when Victory Gardens and I think that it's cool to give students an option of what you can expand on, and then students will feel valued and that they're belonging if they see like, oh, the professor actually took the time to put in a little bit of information about a topic that really interested me. So
yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's a way to give students a sense of ownership over their own learning. And I think Shea, did I pronounce that right? Shea, sorry, speaks to this when in the comment, students can use them as a way to gauge their understanding and identify what they do not understand to seek help. And absolutely, it can be a tool for students to reflect on their own learning as well. So there are a number of benefits to this practice, right? I know that a lot of the conversation around learning outcomes is tied up into this assessment culture, but there is a way you can create craft learning outcomes so they work for you and your students and not necessarily have to be so intertwined and tied to, larger institutional assessment goals and measures. So in backwards design, once we have identified our student learning outcomes, it is then that we look at first our assessments, how we are going to see that students, or see to what degree students have achieved those outcomes. And then you look at your in-class activities or content delivery to help support students in those assessments. So what we're going to do, and you want to make sure they align, right? And by alignment, I mean, say your learning outcome is for students to be able to effectively communicate a position on a controversial topic. But then your assessment is a multiple choice quiz on elements of communication. Those don't necessarily align, right? You're asking students to do something based on memorization versus the learning outcome and goal being an action to effectively communicate something, which they can't necessarily do via multiple choice quiz. And so that's what we mean when we say alignment. And then the activities have to be a way in which to help students achieve that learning outcome. So, do you provide practice on that in the classroom? Do you provide examples and instruction on effective communication? Again, making sure all that is speaking to one another and ultimately speaking to the student learning outcome. So let's take a moment. We have an example here of an objective. And I want you just to think about what assessment do you think would be good to see if students are meeting that objective. So the objective is students will be able to analyze a contemporary scientific debate as portrayed in the media, distinguishing between evidence and conclusions and evaluating the evidence of the latter. So what kind of assessment would you create to measure student progress in this objective? What do you think would be a good measure of this? It doesn't have to be like a big long prompter assessment, but would you give a test? Would you do a group project? Those types of larger constructions. CC says an essay or an individual presentation project. I like both those options. Erica, presentation or paper. Shay, good prompt for a reflective writing statement. Yeah, I think all those align great because in all of those types of assessments, students can engage and analyze. They provide options to analyze the scientific debate, discuss the evidence, and evaluate the evidence. So what would be an example of an assessment that maybe necessarily wouldn't align with this objective? Multiple choice, testing them. Yeah. So kind of the typical testing measure of a multiple choice exam definitely wouldn't be in alignment. Trying to think of another one. An interpretive dance. Yeah, that would be, I've always wanted an interpretive dance assessment. Not really, but yeah, that'd be very hard. That'd be challenging and definitely not in alignment. So from the assessments, you then think of activities that would help them along the way. think about scaffolding it, especially if you're doing a presentation, right? Or a, an essay around this, kind of show them what it is to analyze a scientific debate. You'll have to, find ways in which to engage them in evaluating evidence before they then go on to do the ultimate assessment. And that's what it means to kind of align everything. Okay. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there are limitations of this backwards design approach. So I'm wondering, from this very brief introduction to backwards design, what do you see from the offset, some potential criticisms or limitations from your perspective, your experience as an instructor? Again, we have a QR code you can join, and I'm trying to actually pull up the, there you go. Yeah, you can just chat as well if you want. So let's see. On the Mentimeter, we have too much flexibility that overwhelms students. It's a lot of front end work. Yeah, it is. It does include, a great deal of labor, but the hope is maybe that means you're not putting in as much labor on the back end, but it is a lot of work. So with the too much flexibility that overwhelms students, can either chat or explain that a little bit more, where the flexibility might come in that would be overwhelming?
Okay, so I was thinking a little bit in terms of giving some flexibility when it comes to deadlines to students.
Okay.
I should have been more clear, because flexibility I always think is a positive, but I think that what I've come across when I have been more, how should I say, like had rolling deadlines, or students could choose when they handed in a certain assignment as long as it was done within the duration of the semester. It was almost like students were overwhelmed by overwhelmed by the choice that they had. And then I think that they're, I don't know, I felt like they appreciated it, but it was also like maybe too many assignments got bumped together because yeah. So I meant like more in terms of maybe like deadlines, too much flexibility with deadlines.
Yeah. So Shay said they moved from doing that to doing unit specific hard deadlines, and that helped guide them. So it is kind of this balance between flexibility and structure, because a lot of students also need some structure, that I think we're trying to, as instructors, really figure out post-COVID, where there was great flexibility, and now, trying to bring in some more of that structure. I thought that this was a good chat. You need experience to be able to tailor your material based on students' performance. And that's correct. Yeah. So again, we're talking maybe also about, the labor that's involved when we're thinking about student-centered courses, but you do need that experience. And so that really gets to this idea that teaching is an iterative process that's constantly under revision. So when we set our learning objectives, I think it's important not to be so wedded to those, to, have flexibility in adjusting these objectives based on what you're seeing as far as students' progress in the course. So I think when we're really strict with, these are objectives, this is what, we need to do and meet at the end. I know some of you come from disciplines where there is a larger accreditation body, an exam that they have to pass, a little more difficulty there as far as this flexibility goes. But just realizing that these can be revised, right? You aren't course by course level generally locked into objectives you set from the offset. So in a lot of ways, the backwards design setting objectives doesn't really center equity and inclusion as we may like. But this is something that we need to be or should be intentional about when thinking about our assessments, our teaching, and the classroom activities and environment we set. So the learning objectives, in some ways do take for granted or do seem to come from this framework that all students are entering the classroom with a sameness, right? And, we know that that's not true. And so we need to think about how we can reach the diverse needs and experiences of our students. And so a particular pedagogical practice that you apply in your classroom may help you get to that point. I have highlighted one here. We have a Universal Design for Learning specialist in CELT, Jennifer Pusateri, if you're interested in learning more about this framework. But it's really about recognizing that students engage differently, that they might be able to take in information in different ways. And there are also different ways that they can express knowledge. So, for example, for our assessments, making sure that we include a diverse range of assessments. We're not just doing tests, right? We're not just doing papers. That there is different ways in which students can show and demonstrate their knowledge in our class. So that's essentially what we need to think about when we can start our course planning process with this backwards design, with thinking about student learning outcomes. But when we enter the classroom, really thinking about who our students are and adjusting our pedagogical approaches to meet their varying needs. And so this brings me to what CJ will be exploring a bit more discussion and exploration of course design and thinking about our students and putting our students at the center of our teaching at our Lunch and Learn session on Tuesday, September 19th from 12 to 1 p.m. And that is via Zoom. You can scan that QR code on the screen to register for that Lunch and Learn session. And I think the Zoom link for that session is at the end of the at the end of the registration there. We encourage you all to attend. I think CJ has chosen some great materials in which to have a deeper discussion around kind of this broad overview that I've given to you today. So with the time we have left, if there are any questions or additional comments, I'm happy to take those. We have about 3 minutes, but I'm happy to stick around if there's anything you want to discuss further.
I have a quick question regarding the backward design.
Yes.
So let's say, for example, like the way I'm thinking about it, whenever like you don't design content, for example, but you need to do assessment first. Is that right? So how do you do the assessment, for example, like do an essay or something if the students haven't learned anything yet? Is that more of like a pre-assessment quiz or like pre-assessment assignment with that material? And the other question that I have is, actually, I feel like with backward design, because you're doing assessment, in this case, you're doing more inclusion of like, students' population and how they, you're kind of covering their understanding and seeing like who understands and who's what. So why would it be a limitation for this aspect, the diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so both good questions. I'll take the first one. So when I'm talking about, you think about the learning outcomes and then the assessments, this is just when you're first, say, designing your syllabus. When you go into class, of course, that's not the order you're going to go in, right? But when you're designing your syllabus, when you're designing the structure of the class, to make sure it is student-centered and there's alignment between the learning outcomes and how you're testing those learning outcomes, that's kind of the order you go to. Of course, in class, you're going to start with the learning, with the end in mind, and then how are you going to get students to that end with the activities and then the assessment.
So you mean like you give a lecture, like you design the concept is in your head when you're designing the syllabus. Then you
Yes.
go teach, and then you do assessment. If the students didn't do well, for example, you adjust as you go. Is that
Yes.
how? Oh, I see. I
Yep.
see.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Cool.
so,
Thank you.
yeah, of course. And so when we're thinking about equity as far as our assessments go, I think what we're considering is, are the right supports in place for students? So are you providing, this is really about a classroom environment issue that we're really not addressing when we're thinking about backwards design as this strict framework. So are you providing the support for students to be able to do well in the assessment? Is the support equal across students? Are you communicating that? Are you checking in with them, making sure that they are understanding along the way? Are you doing kind of these smaller assessment measures that aren't big stakes, that might be anxiety provoking? And I think, well, we have to recognize, some students might be more skilled in writing versus in doing a presentation. So is there a place where we can give option? You can either write a paper or you can do a 10-minute presentation. And so trying to meet students where they are in that way.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you
Yep.
so much.
Yep. Any other questions, comments? All right, then. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. And I look forward to the Lunch and Learn